You have your Bible with you. You'd like to use one in the back of the pew. Turn with me to the Old Testament book of Jonah. The Old Testament book of Jonah, chapter 1. If you're less familiar with that territory of the Bible, it is just after the big prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah. Or you could go to Matthew and turn left a little bit. Jonah is one of the minor prophets of the Bible. They're called the minor prophets not because they're unimportant people, so you should read them, but because they're smaller. The books are smaller than the major prophets, which are much, much longer. But this the next month or so, we're going to be working through this minor prophet, Jonah, to talk about a terrible prophet and the incredible grace of God. That's what this book is about. You may have heard stories from Jonah. They're pretty popular. But Jonah is not so much about a fish or a city or even a prophet. It's about the grace of God. And this morning I want to show you that in chapter 1 as we look at Jonah on the boat. Jonah chapter 1, this is the word of the Lord. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. When I was growing up, I would do just about anything I could to get out of my chores. I tried everything. Now, one time when I was growing up, I was responsible for vacuuming the entire house. And if I wanted to play outside or play games or do anything that I wanted to do, I had to vacuum the house. And so my mom's in another room, and I am pretty sneaky, right? So I get the vacuum, I take it to the living room, and I plug it in, and I turn it on, and then I go sit on the couch. And I just let it run for a good 10 minutes or so. I wanted to know I am working hard at vacuuming the house. I finish, and I unplug the vacuum, and I yell across the hallway, "Hey, Mom, I vacuumed. The only thing is it didn't make any marks on the carpet. I don't know what that's about, Mom." Well, I didn't get past her. She kind of understood what was going on, and she said, "Son, vacuum until you see the marks." Could not get past her. Now, that may not have always been the case. I might have pulled one over on her a time or two. But that's the way some of us think we can treat God. That we can disobey him, we can elude his commands, we can go our own way and sneak past him. Sneak something by him. But God, unlike us, knows all things, works all things, he sees all things, and we get nothing by him. This is what the prophet Jonah shows us in chapter 1. Friends, no matter how hard we try, no matter how far we run, you cannot escape the sovereignty of God. That is what Jonah is all about. You cannot outrun him. You cannot flee him. You cannot hide from him. You cannot escape the sovereignty of God. The word sovereign means that God has unlimited power to control nature and history and all things. Unlimited control. I want to show you this in Jonah chapter 1. 4 places we see the sovereignty of God. The first one is in verses 1 to 2. God calls his servant. God calls his servant. Look again at verses 1 to 2. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." Now notice, this story does not start with Jonah or a fish. It starts with God. Now the word of the Lord came. Now, this is a basic introduction for any prophet. God takes his word to his prophet to send to his people so that they can go his way. It's pretty basic. But right away we see this is anything but basic. First, there's the prophet. We don't know much about him. What we do know is in 2 Kings 14, verses 23 to 27. We're not going to turn there today. You can look that up if you want to read more about Jonah. But what we see in 2 Kings is that Jonah served on the wrong side of Israel under the wrong kind of king. It was an evil king in North Israel. And in spite of that, Jonah's message is not that God would curse Israel in its evil, but that God would bless them. It was an interesting message. Jonah was really the wrong kind of prophet, and he sent to the wrong kind of people. Occasionally, a prophet in the Old Testament was given a message about somebody else, about another country. Never, nowhere, anywhere else is a prophet told to go to another country, much less a country like Nineveh. Nineveh was a leading city in the country of Assyria. Assyria is where today you find Iraq and Syria, the home of ISIS. And Assyria in Jonah's day was about as bad as Syria and Iraq in our day. It was a nasty nation. One commentator calls them Nineveh a metropolis of maniacs. Friends, if we were in charge, if we were sovereign, if we were writing the book of Jonah, things would be different. We would pick a prophet that we recognize, who has a greater prestige, someone who's not afraid to face an evil king and tell him like it is. We would pick a different nation, probably somewhere safer, probably somewhere with less political baggage. This would not be our mission. And if it went that way, we would see nothing of God's glory and nothing of his grace. Isaiah 55 verses 8 and 9 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Before we go any further, friend, when is the last time God surprised you? When's the last time God worked in your life in a way that you did not expect? Called you to do something you would not anticipate? God's plans do not have to make sense to you. Do you know that? His ability to work, to move, and what he's calling you to do is not limited by your ability to understand it. You and I need to be ready for God to leave us scratching our heads and still be okay following him. He writes the story better than we ever will. We see the sovereignty of God when he calls his servant Jonah. In verse 3, we even see it when God gets rejected by his servant. Look at verse 3. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Let's do a little geography really quick. It'll help for the rest of the book. Nineveh was east. Right? Nineveh was east of Israel. All right, towards the Middle East. Jonah goes to find a boat to Tarshish, which was west. Most people believe that Tarshish is in Spain. So Jonah is called to go to the Middle East and instead goes to Western Europe. He is trying to go as far from obedience as possible. He is doing the exact opposite. He's not only disobeying, he is doing the exact opposite of what God has asked him to do. We don't see all the reasons now. We will later. But twice in verse 3, it says that Jonah was trying to go away from the presence of the Lord. Now, what that does not mean is that Jonah thought he could literally get outside of God's presence. Jonah is severely familiar with the book of Psalms. In Psalm 139, verse 7 to 8, it says, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there." Jonah, when he's trying to get away from God's presence, what he's trying to do has to do with his role as a prophet. If you read about the prophets, their job, their duty was to stand in God's presence and to serve him by giving the word. So as Jonah is trying to get away from the presence, what he's doing is trying to get rid of his job as a prophet to stand in the presence. He is saying, I absolutely want nothing to do with serving you, God. I am done. That's what Jonah is doing here. Now, friends, prophet or not, you know this. It describes every single one of us. Maybe God has not called you to Nineveh, but you've told him no somewhere. Maybe you haven't disobeyed God like Jonah did, but you've rejected his call in other ways. Isaiah 53:6 says, "All we like sheep have gone astray. Everyone has turned to his own way." Friends, it's me and you. Every one of us, even those of us who belong to Christ. Don't you know what? We still do this. We still hear from the Lord and we decide we know better. We don't want to do it that way, and we turn the other way. We go our own way. How does that describe your life right now? What is God calling you to do that you're resisting, that you're rejecting, you're refusing to serve him? What is God calling you to do? Allow Jonah to show you. You can run from God, but you cannot outrun him. You need to listen to him when he calls. Now, some of you may be thinking right now, how in the world does this show us God's sovereignty? doesn't this actually show God giving up control and letting Jonah do whatever he wants and not being sovereign in the moment? For Jonah may have dethroned God in his heart, but God never left his throne. And I want you to step outside this book really quick and remember, first off, God has some plans for Jonah. He's actually working in Jonah's life right now to write a book of the Bible to give you and me, to point us to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Even in his rejection that's going to lead to a big fish and a resurrection, God is sovereign over what is happening as Jonah rejects him. But it's even clear in verse 3. It's even clear in this verse. Jonah heads for Tarshish. He gets to the seaport, looks for a boat, and what does he find? It's in verse 3. He finds a boat, a ship, going to Tarshish. Do you not think God would be in control enough, sovereign enough, to stop Jonah from finding the right boat? To make sure that the only boats that day at sea were going east, and to prevent him from getting on a boat going west. Like Romans 1, God is giving Jonah away to his idolatry. He is letting it happen so that he can show Jonah patience to show Jonah grace. God is sovereign even as Jonah becomes the prodigal prophet and runs away from God. Because God is the Father who runs towards his Son. But, unlike the prodigal father, this time, God is not running to Jonah to give him a hug. God is running after Jonah to show him something else. And that's where we see God's sovereignty in the third place. In verses 4 to 7, we see that God pursues his servant. God pursues his servant. And there's three ways that this happens in verses 4 to 7. First, in verse 4, there's the storm. Look at verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. The word hurled is a violent term. It's like God is throwing a weapon at the boat, like he's taking a spear and aiming it at Jonah's ship and attacking it. He's launching out an attack on Jonah. And the writer is making it crystal clear, this wind, this storm is not an accident. The Lord hurled it this way. God is behind it. And the crew, the sailors, they react like anybody would when a huge God-ordained storm jumps on your ship. They panic, they pray, they do whatever it takes. They're trying to survive. But what's Jonah doing? Jonah goes down to the boat, ignores the storm, ignores the people on the boat who do not know God, who are about to die, and he goes to sleep to avoid and to ignore any conviction, anything in his heart, in the rebellion that he's experiencing. He goes to sleep. But no matter how hard Jonah tries, God keeps pursuing. Because after the storm in verse 6, he pursues him with the captain. Look at verse 6. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." Now there is something happening underneath these words. The captain does not know it, but every word he speaks is a nightmare to Jonah. If you compare it to verse 2, the captain is basically repeating the mission God has called Jonah to. First word out of his mouth, arise. That's what God said. Pray, stand before God in his presence. Maybe God will think about us. Well, that's exactly what Jonah is worried about. Even an unbeliever practically begs the prophet of God to be who he is. But even with life's on the line, Jonah is the only one on the boat who does not pray. The lost people are praying, the prophet is not. And God keeps pursuing him. Not only with the storm, not only with the captain, but in verse 7, with the lots. Look at verse 7. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Last couple weeks, my kids and I have been enjoying playing Yahtzee. And we have learned that you can't be really that good at Yahtzee. You have to have a little bit of luck. And we played game after game after game. And for some reason, my son just could not land a Yahtzee. Well, the other day, the last roll of the game, this man rolls a Yahtzee and wins the whole thing. It was a fun day. But the Bible teaches in the Old Testament, lots were like dice. And this is hard for us to understand. Dice seem like a random thing. But the Bible teaches that God is sovereign even over what seems random to us. And he uses the lots, the dice, if you will, to expose Jonah. Now the lots, they weren't 6-sided dice with 1 to 6. They were 2-sided. They had 2 different colors. And basically one color meant yes and one color meant no. And so the crew start rolling dice and they're just naming guys off. And they're like, is it this guy? Is it this guy's fault? Is it the captain's fault? He's not paying enough. Who is it? And they roll the lots for Jonah, and it finally flips for the first time. A 50-50 chance for the first time it lands on Jonah. The whole time, Jonah is back there just shaking his head down, mouth shut. He knows it's about to happen. He can feel it. It's going to land on me. It's going to land on me. It's going to land on me. And it does. He refuses. He won't admit it. And God calls him out. God is hunting Jonah. Do you think you know what grace looks like? You think some of us would. We've been in church, many of us, for a long time. We sing about grace. We talk about grace. But do we actually know what it even looks like in real life? Friends, grace is a 2-sided lot with 2 colors. When we think that grace always lands on yes, and God says, yes, I accept you, grace. Yes, I love you, grace. Yes, I'll let you get away with it this time. I forgive you. But friends, there's another side of grace. Grace is a lot that can land on no. And God can say, no, I will not let you run any farther. No, I will not let you get away. No, I will not keep this a secret. No, I am coming after you. Has God ever made the lot land on no for you? When's the last time God showed you that side of grace? When he didn't give it to you, he took it away. He didn't let you have what you want. He didn't let you keep going in your sin. And even against your own effort, he brought it all to an end and exposed you. That is the severe grace of God. If you're not a Christian, and that's happening in your life, what that may be, I don't know this for certain, what it may be is that God is calling you to him and asking you to come follow him so that he can show you the other side of his grace. But if you're a believer, God still shows that kind of grace to us. In fact, he does so more often. We see that in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 5 and 6. It says, "My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives." Friends, when God tells you no, it might be because he loves you. It might be because you're his child. And it definitely is because he is sovereign. That's the good news. The bad news is sometimes it can hurt. But we need to learn to thank God when he says no. Think about that the next time he shows you the severe grace. But the most amazing place we see the sovereignty of God in chapter 1 is next. Because even before he rescues Jonah, which doesn't happen until chapter 2, even before Jonah turns, confesses, repents, follows, before all of that, God uses his servant. God uses Jonah before any of that in verses 8 to 16. Look at verses 8 to 16. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation and where do you come from? What is your country and of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood for you. O Lord, you have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Now this will not fit in some of our little boxes that we put God in. But Jonah chapter 1 shows us that God is so sovereign. Jonah ends up doing the thing he refuses to do. Jonah ends up reaching and witnessing to lost pagans even as he tries to run away from his call to do so. And God uses a rebel, not a servant, to do his will. Let me show you 3 places where this happens. First, in verses 8 to 9, Jonah shares who God is. They drill him with questions. When the lot lands on Jonah, they just bombard him, ask him everything they can think of. In an answer loaded with irony and not a lot of weight, Jonah says, "I fear the Lord." Well, no, he doesn't. Where's the fear at, Jonah? But as weak as his testimony is, God uses it to point the sailors to his character. And just as an aside, as an encouragement, think about that. You may feel like you're nervous to share your testimony, your story with someone else. Your story is not any weaker than Jonah's. Let me tell you that. I'm sure it is far greater. But God could take the mustard seed, the little truth in Jonah's story and the lack of experience in his life and use it in the life of these sailors. God can use you. God can use you as you share your testimony about what God has done in your life. But in verses 10 to 12, we also see that God uses Jonah to show them the danger of sin. They find out he's running from God. He's told them that. And he tells them the only way to deal with it is to kill him. Throw him over. And immediately what the sailors see is the truth. Romans 6:23, that the wages of sin is death. They fought it. They tried to row against God. They said, "No, brother, we're going to save your life. We're going to get to shore. We're not going to kill you." And God said, No. You cannot escape the sovereignty of God, even with good intentions. He must die. The wages of sin is death. So Jonah, in his rebellion, shows them who God is. He shows them what sin is. But then in verses 13 to 16, amazingly, somehow, against his will, Jonah brings them to faith in God. In verses 13 to 16. Somehow, because of his confession, I fear the Lord, who made heaven and earth, these sailors turn to prayer. Again, they keep praying while Jonah's doing nothing. But instead of idols, they turn to the one true God. And look at their prayer. Verse 14. O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. Do you hear what the sailors are praying? The beginning of the chapter started with Jonah saying, God, I do what I want. And it ends with pagan sailors saying, God, you do what you want. They are praying the sovereignty of God. And when Jonah is tossed over, the storm immediately stops. And look at where we find ourselves. God's prophet is left to die in a place of judgment while the pagans worship. When Jonah ran in verse 3, do you think he ever thought it would end like this? Do you think in a million years he thought, as he went the opposite direction, that God would take him his direction? Do you not think God can do that with you? Friends, do not think that Jonah is about a giant fish. Jonah is about a giant God. I want to leave you with 3 truths that Jonah gives us to take home, to build your life upon. Because as we look to the great God, we have a God we can trust. We can sing, great is thy faithfulness. We can trust as we follow him. We can trust as he gives us the hard no, the hard side of his grace. But Jonah 1 shows us God's greatness above all things. He's over all nations. Assyria and Israel. America and China. He's over obedience and he's over all human sin. Proverbs 19:21 says, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. It shows us God's self-sufficiency. Think about this. Self-sufficiency means God does not need anybody. He does not need us. God uses the sailors and the captain to speak to Jonah more than he uses Jonah to speak to him. He's not dependent on Jonah. Friends, God may call us to serve him, but never think he needs to. Acts 17, verse 24 to 25. The God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, is not served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. You need that great picture of God. You need that self-sufficiency. You need to understand his independence to be blown away by the grace of Jesus Christ. At the end of Mark 4, we find Jesus asleep on a boat, and God hurls a storm at him. And Jesus wakes up, goes to the top of the boat, and with his sovereign word calms the storm. But Jesus did not experience the storm on the boat because he was running from God, running from God's call. He experienced it because he was running to God. He was running to God's call. While we deserved to die, while the storm was our fault, God threw Jesus overboard in our place. He put him at the place of judgment. At the cross, Jesus took the raging storm of the wrath of God so that the wind and the seas could cease raging against us, so that we could be like the sailors and worship the one true God. Romans 5:8, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Oh, friend, if you are running from God like Jonah today, and you do not know the Savior Jesus Christ, God has brought his word to you to show you, listen, he sees you. He knows what you're doing. He knows that you're running. He knows what you're trying to do. And he cares. He cares enough to show you the severe side of his grace, to tell you, you will not escape. You cannot get away from him. He is God. And his grace is big enough for you to turn away from anything that's happened in your life, any rebellion against him, any sin that you've committed against him. His grace is big enough to take you back, because Jesus Christ paid the penalty that you deserved and rose again on the third day so that you could have life. Listen. Stop running. Come home to God. But if you're a believer, if you're in a position more like Jonah and you're running from God's call, whatever it is, look at Jonah. How exactly do you think it will end for you? If you're telling God no, do not be shocked when his grace tells you no. Stop making him show you that side of his grace. Look at Jonah and turn to Christ before it's too late. You need to trust his sovereignty, trust his plan for you, and follow him. But even if you're running with him, even if you're following him, you're not in a season like Jonah where you're running away from him. You need to look at the amazing truth of his grace that God never needed to call you. He never needed to use you. But by his grace, he did. By his grace, he said, I have a mission. I have something for you to do. I want you to be a part of the team. You're not better than anybody else. You're just like the sailors, but get on board. Let's go. Let's be a part of mission together. The God of heaven and earth has done that in your life. Never think for 1 second it's because of who you are. Remember, it's because of who God is. And so instead of thinking of all the ways that we can run from God, let's remember we cannot escape him, so we might as well run with him. That is a race that is always worth running. Let us pray.